Today we're going to be reading White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. Not the whole book, but her original 2011 paper. Let's begin. White people in North America live in a social environment that protects and insulates them from race-based stress. This insulated environment of racial protection builds white expectations for racial comfort while at the same time lowering the ability to tolerate racial stress, leading to what I refer to as white fragility. She basically said the same half of a sentence, like 3 or 4 times. Wild. White fragility is a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves. These moves include the outward display of emotions such as anger, fear, and guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and leaving the stress-inducing situation. These behaviors in turn function to reinstate white racial equilibrium. This paper explicates the dynamics of white fragility. Negative emotions and avoidance are examples of white fragility. She's just racial stress. Jesus Christ. It's all in italics. I am a white woman. I am standing beside a black woman. We are facing a group of white people who are seated in front of us. We are in their workplace and have been hired by their employer to lead them in a dialogue about race. The room is filled with tension and charged with hostility. I have just presented a definition of racism that includes the acknowledgement that whites hold social and institutional power over people of color. A white man is pounding his fist on the table. His face is red and he is furious. As he pounds, he yells, "White people have been discriminated against for 25 years. A white person can't get a job anymore." I look around the room and see 40 employed people, all white. There are no people of color in this workplace. I had to scroll down. Something is happening here, and it isn't based in the racial reality of the workplace. I am feeling unnerved by this man's disconnection with that reality and his lack of sensitivity to the impact that is having on my co-facilitator, the only person of color in the room. Why is this white man so angry? Why is he being so careless about the impact of his anger? Why are all the other white people either sitting in silent agreement with him or tuning out? We have, after all, only articulated a definition of racism. We've just done this. Good Lord. Such a fucking crybaby. Oh, we haven't even gotten into the meat of the paper. And already it's like, we're just talking about a definition. No, I guarantee you're not. That also sounds like a made-up scenario. I don't know. But that, I don't want to minimize someone's personal truth. Anyways. White people in North America live in a social environment that protects and insulates them from race-based stress. We've heard that sentence 4 times before, but okay. Fine, in 1997, identifies this insulation when she observes how whiteness accrues privilege and status, gets itself surrounded by protective pillows of resources and or benefits of the doubt. How whiteness repels gossip and voyeurism and instead demands dignity. Whites are rarely without these protective pillows, and when they are, it is usually temporary and by choice. This insulated environment of racial privilege builds white expectations for racial comfort while at the same time lowering the ability to tolerate racial stress. Sure, maybe it's that, maybe it's they don't like you attacking them and just being an asshole and accusatory, but sure, maybe it's that. Anyways, for many white people, a single required multicultural education course taken in college or required a cultural competency training in their workplace is the only time they may encounter a direct and sustained challenge to their racial understandings I bet that's all that's going on. Whatever. But even in this arena, not all multicultural courses or training programs talk directly about racism, much less address white privilege. Because if they don't already agree, then they're being fragile. It's the same kind of thing we talked about with Freire. If you don't believe it, then you're just avoiding the reality of it. If you don't just shut up and accept their position, you're just diluting yourself. You're just these emotions, they're trying to protect you from the harsh and painful reality that is their reality, which is the truth, which is what you need to give up. And it's not a cult, guys. It is far more the norm for these courses and programs to use racially coded language such as urban, inner city, and disadvantaged, but to rarely use white or overadvantaged or privileged. Sure, because I bet that's what they're talking about. This racially coded language reproduces racist images and perspectives while it simultaneously reproduces the comfortable illusion that race and its problems are what they have, not us. I'm feeling some major projection here. Reasons why the facilitators of these courses and trainings may not directly name the dynamics and beneficiaries of racism range from the lack of a valid analysis of racism by white facilitators, personal and economic survival strategies for facilitators of color, and the overall pressure from management to keep the content comfortable and palatable for whites. Sure. However, if and when an educational program does directly affect racism and the privileging of whites, common white responses include anger, withdrawal, emotional incapacitation, guilt, argumentation, and cognitive dissonance, all of which reinforce the pressure on facilitators to avoid directly addressing racism. It couldn't possibly be that we're wrong in our presumption. It couldn't possibly. Why are they getting so defensive? We're just trying to let them know that they absolutely are racist and very privileged above all of these other people. It doesn't matter what they've done or anything. Anyways, so-called progressive whites may not respond with anger, but may still insulate themselves via claims that they are beyond the need for engaging with the content because they, quote, already had a class on this or already know this. These reactions are often in anti-racist educational endeavors as forms of resistance to the challenge of internalized dominance. These reactions do indeed function as resistance, but it may be useful to also conceptualize them as the result of the reduced psychosocial stamina that racial insulation inculcates. I call this lack of racial stamina white fragility. See, it just shows the fact that you're getting tired of having to talk about this. It shows that you are privileged and you are fragile. And it doesn't matter if you've already had the course. You're just trying to avoid having the course again in another way. It doesn't matter. You haven't fully accepted it. You haven't done your penance. It's not a cult, guys. Although mainstream definitions of racism are typically some variation of individual race prejudice, which anyone of any race can have, whiteness scholars define racism as encompassing economic, political, social, and cultural structures, actions, and beliefs that systematize and perpetuate an unequal distribution of privileges, resources, and power between white people and people of color. Now, see, remember this is really fucking stupid, but it makes a whole lot of sense if you come from the position that they believe various demographics have a shared communal soul. Some people called it the folk soul. Some people called it the will, the people's will, um, what have you. But once you understand that, and the will of the folk spirit is enacted through our actions, whether conscious or otherwise, then it makes sense. Oh, these people are fucking psycho collectivists. It's not a cult, guys. This unequal distribution benefits whites and disadvantages people of color overall as a group. Collectively. Racism is not fluid in the US. It does not flow back and forth, one day benefiting whites and another day, or even era benefiting people of color. They're talking about like a sort of fate kind of thing. Like historical blood vengeance kind of thing. That's what they're talking about. The direction of power between whites and people of color is historic, traditional, normalized, and deeply embedded in the fabric of U.S. society. So that's what they mean by, oh, white people can't be racist when they're talking about racism. They mean capital R, racism. They're talking about that collectivist shit again. They're talking about that collective soul. Later, we'll get into why this is just an insane Gnostic cult. Whiteness itself refers to the specific dimensions of racism that serve to elevate white people over people of color. This definition counters the dominant representation of racism in mainstream education as isolated and discrete behaviors that some individuals may or may not demonstrate, and goes beyond naming specific privileges. Because it doesn't matter what you do or how you think or anything, so long as the end result isn't what they want, it's not good enough. Because what they ultimately want is communism. Because it doesn't matter what you do or what you try, so as long as you get to the end, as long as the end result isn't their preferred success, then it hasn't really, it's the same shit. Anyways, whites are theorized as actively shaped, affected, defined, and elevated through their racialization and the individual and collective consciousness formed within it. Collective consciousness, that's, yeah. Recognizing that the terms I'm using are not theory-neutral descriptors, but theory-laden constructs, inseparable from systems of injustice. I use the terms white and whiteness to describe a social process. Frankenberg defines whiteness as multidimensional. We'll touch on a one-dimensional man later. Frankenberg says, whiteness is a location of structural advantage, of race privilege. Second, it is a standpoint, a place from which white people look at ourselves, at others. Oh, and every time it says white or white people, white is capitalized. So they're talking about a specific term. When you're reading it, it makes a lot more sense. They're separating terms out and then being fast and loose so you can keep better track of it. A place for which white people look at ourselves, at others, and at society. Third, whiteness. There's always scare quotes. Whiteness refers to a set of cultural practices that are usually unmarked and unnamed. Frankenberg and other theorists use whiteness to signify a set of locations that are historically, socially, politically, and culturally produced, and which are intrinsically linked to dynamic relations of domination. Anytime they talk about historically, they think there's like a mystical blood vengeance kind of thing. It's like, well, historically we've been marginalized. Like, no, you weren't alive then. But again, they're talking about the eternal folk soul, the racial spirit, or the collective consciousness, which they then think can be repaid back and holds life debt or whatever. And anytime they're talking about multidimensional, that's the upper dimension they're talking about. Whiteness is thus conceptualized as a constellation of processes and practices rather than as a discrete entity. Whiteness is dynamic, relational, and operating at all times and on myriad levels. These processes and practices include basic rights, values, beliefs, perspectives, and experiences supported to be commonly shared by all, but which are actually only consistently afforded to white people. She's making a whole lot of bold assertions of what she believes and what she believes that other people believe. Whiteness studies begin with the premise that racism and white privilege exist in both traditional and modern forms, and rather than work to prove its existence, work to reveal it. See, they come from the standpoint of it is already true, and it doesn't matter what you think. It doesn't matter. They have to reveal it, meaning they have to convince you of it. And once you are convinced, well, that's the same as revealing because it's already true. Duh. This article will explore the dynamics of one aspect of whiteness and its effects, white fragility. Okay. A lot of these concepts and the revealing and all of that come from a period where they were still trying to suss out the ins and outs and terminology for belief, knowledge, things like that, where they didn't have quite as sophisticated a vocabulary for it seems to be this way. It's like, well, you know something, but I know something, but they know something, and how does that all work, and what is true knowledge? And it's that same shit from Hegel. And good Lord. Triggers. White fragility is a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, staggering a range of defensive moves. These moves include the outward display of emotions such as anger, fear, and guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and leaving the stress-inducing situation. These behaviors, in turn, function to reinstate white racial equilibrium. Racial stress results from an interruption to what is racially familiar. These interruptions can take a variety of forms and come from a range of sources, including suggesting that a white person's viewpoint comes from a racialized frame of reference, challenge to objectivity. People of color talking directly about their racial perspectives, a challenge to white racial codes. People of color choosing not to protect the racial feelings of white people in regards to race, a challenge to white racial expectations and need entitlement to racial comfort. People of color not being willing to tell their story or answer questions about their racial experiences, a challenge to colonialist relations. A fellow white not providing agreement with one's interpretations, a challenge to white solidarity. Receiving feedback that one's behavior had a racist impact, a challenge to white liberalism. Suggesting that group membership is significant, a challenge to individualism. Good Lord. An acknowledgement that access is unequal between racial groups, a challenge to meritocracy. Being presented with a person of color in a position of leadership, a challenge to white authority. Being presented with information about other racial groups through, for example, movies in which people of color drive the action but are not in stereotypical roles, or multicultural education, a challenge to white centrality. So remember, you're just displaying white fragility if you make any kind of moves that only include, but aren't limited to, outward displays of emotion, as well as behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and leaving the, arguing, disagreeing. That's what if you don't just lay down and enthusiastically go with it, then you're just showing your white fragility. It couldn't possibly be that they're wrong. It's that you are fragile in your collective white soul. In a white-dominant environment, each of these challenges becomes exceptional. In turn, whites are often at a loss for how to respond in constructive ways, ways that only they like, just the submitting. That's what they're talking about. Whites have not had to build the cognitive or affective skills or develop the stamina that would allow for constructive engagement across racial divides. Just as an assertion, just because they said so. Bourdieu's concept of habitus in 1993 may be useful here. According to Bourdieu, habitus is a socialized subjectivity, a set of dispositions which generate practices and perceptions. This is the same thing as the Marxist false consciousness kind of thing. That if you don't align with this, you're just sort of showing your false consciousness, your false awareness of everything. And it only goes away if you awaken to their truth and reality. And it's not possible for it to be wrong because any disagreement is just showing these things. It's an unfalsifiable collectivist horseshit. As such, habitus only exists in, through, and because of the practices of actors and their interaction with each other and with the rest of their environment. Based on the previous conditions and experiences that produce it, habitus produces and reproduces thoughts, perceptions, expressions, and actions. Remember back when we were reading about the drag pedagogy? That the nation state is a controlling evil Gnostic prison that reproduces itself through you. This is the same shit. Don't believe me? Go read Drag Pedagogy. It's on the Drag Story Hour website. Go to the resources in the corner. Strategies of response to disequilibrium in the habitus are not based on conscious intentionality, but rather result from unconscious dispositions towards practice and depend on the power position the agent occupies in the social structure. White fragility may be conceptualized as a product of the habitus, a response or a condition produced and reproduced by the continual social and material advantages of the white structural position. See, you're part of all of this, but you don't even know that you're unconsciously. They basically think you're Agent Smith or anyone who hasn't been awakened in the Matrix. That's what they think. That you're unconsciously being driven by the thing, the habitus, the false consciousness, in Gnosticism they call it the demiurge. That's what they think of you. If you don't awaken, become woke, or realize, if you don't realize the Gnostic prison that you're in, you're actively a part, you're as good as an Agent Smith to them. Omi and Winnant posit the U.S. racial order is an unstable equilibrium, kept equilibrated by the state, but still unstable due to continual conflicts of interest and challenges to the racial order. Okay? It's just more of what I'm saying. Using Omi and Winnant's concept of unstable racial equilibrium, white privilege can be thought of as unstable racial equilibrium at the level of habitus. I'm sure it can be thought of that way if you choose to think of it that way. That doesn't mean that that's what that is. But if you just keep digging into it, you start to realize none of what they're saying is even what they're asserting as reality. It's simply, if you can think of it that way, it's as good as fact. The whole thing, I've said this before, any critical theory, it's literally just choosing whatever lens you decide, whether it's sex and race and sexuality or anything, or economics, and choosing to use that lens and choosing to find a way in which this is true. It's confirmation bias insanity. They know full well what they're doing. They say it outright in their own papers. You just read the damn thing. It's they're not even lying about it. They don't hide it. You just read it for yourself. And the only way for it to be hidden from you is if you're choosing not to read it, or if you're actually just convinced that it's already true. Which means you're not actually reading it. When any of the above triggers, challenges in the habitus occur, the resulting disequilibrium becomes intolerable. Because white fragility finds its support in and is a function of white privilege, fragility and privilege result in responses that function to restore equilibrium and return the resources lost via the challenge, resistance towards the trigger, shutting down and or tuning out, indulging in emotional incapacitation such as guilt or hurt feelings, exiting, or a combination of these responses. Remember, the only correct response is to submit. Because if you resist, if you disagree, if you argue, if you even just walk away from the conversation, you are showing and reinforcing your white fragility. You're just showing that you're being fragile because your white privilege is this demon of white privilege is trying to keep you maintaining it. The white privilege demon is trying to keep itself alive. And so it fatigues you. It causes you to do these things. Maybe it makes you disagree. It doesn't matter if it's not true or not. It is true because it's not a cult, guys. The habitus, the Agent Smith, it's just using you unconsciously. Factors that inculcate white fragility. Segregation. The first factor leading to white fragility is the segregated lives which most white people live. Even if white people live in physical proximity to people of color, and this would be exceptional outside an urban or temporarily mixed class neighborhood, segregation occurs on multiple levels, including representational and informational. That good Lord! I don't know if South Park could write something that fucking racist. Good God. Because whites live primarily segregated lives in a white-dominant society, they receive little or no authentic information about racism and are thus unprepared to think about it critically or with complexity. Again, this doesn't make sense unless you realize they're talking collectively. They're not talking individually, they're talking collectively. And they say they're nice and vague enough with their words so they can kind of shimmy it around as needed. Growing up in segregated environments, schools, workplaces, neighborhoods, media images, and historical perspectives, white interests and perspectives are almost always central. An inability to see or consider significance in the perspectives of people of color results. But remember that it said, even if they live in if it's not physically segregated, even if it's a mixed race community or anything. So what segregated environments are they talking about? Representational and informational. Again, these people are always talking about stories and aesthetics. Aesthetics is just optics or how they feel it looks. Or, again, more importantly, how it actually looks. How can they find a way to look at it so that it could potentially look like an issue? That's the same with any critical theory. They're only concerned with optics because they're not actually concerned with truth. We'll get into Michel Foucault on truth, and actual objective truth isn't real because, remember, this is Robin DiAngelo. Whose truth? Your truth? My truth? Does a chicken cry and commit suicide? That Robin DiAngelo. This is who this is. They don't care about truth. They care about, can they find a way, while choosing to find a way, have an issue with how they are looking at something. That's it. That's why they're so concerned with representation. If you pay close enough attention, you'll find them talking about aesthetics. They mean optics. They mean how they choose to look at it. Further, white people are taught not to feel any loss over the absence of people of color in their lives. And in fact, this absence is what defines their schools and neighborhoods as a good. Whites come to understand that a good school or good neighborhood is coded language for white. That's massive projection. In another CRT paper, they were describing the black schools versus the white schools. But they were being fast and loose with comparing poor black schools with upper class white schools. They're choosing to look at it through this particular lens with this particular goal. And if they can possibly look at it a certain way, then it's as good as truth to them. The quality of white space being in large part measured via the absence of people of color, and blacks in particular, is a profound message indeed, one that is deeply internalized and reinforced daily through normalized discourses about good schools and neighborhoods. I'm sure that would be if that were true, but it's not, so go fuck yourself. This dynamic of gain rather than loss via racial segregation may be the most profound aspect of white racial socialization of all. Yet, while discourses about what makes a space good are tacitly understood as racially coded, this coding is explicitly denied by whites. So she's outright saying that bad schools are predominantly black schools are bad because they're black schools, and it's not actually bad, it's just how they're perceived to be bad. White fragility, everybody. Remember, if you disagree, if you choose not to think about this, if you avoid it, anything, you're demonstrating your white fragility. You're aiding and reinforcing the habitus through you, the white supremacy demiurge that's just reproducing itself through you. You're an agent of the Matrix, and you don't even know it. It's so sad. Universalism and Individualism. Remember, it's collectivist. It's just more collectivist shit. Whites are taught to see their perspectives as objective and representative of reality. The belief in objectivity, as opposed to not trying to be objective, coupled with positioning white people as outside of culture and thus the norm of humanity, allows whites to view themselves as universal humans who can represent all of human experience. Fuck no. No. Typically, white people are positioned outside culture because we are claimed to have no culture. Because people like to conflate culture with color. You know, the Americans or white people don't have culture. That's not a self-positioning, but again, it doesn't really matter. It's aesthetics. This is evidenced through an unracialized identity or location, which functions as a kind of blindness, an inability to think about whiteness as an identity or as a state of being that would or could have an impact on one's life. Because you're not hyperfixated on race at all times, you're just trying to show that you are the objective arbiter of humanity. But you can't really see that that's what you are trying to do of yourself. The self-awareness is just not there. Whiteness is not recognized or named by white people. That's just what I fucking said. She says they position themselves, but it's not recognized or named by them. But remember, it's just a subconscious reproducing of the demiurge. The habitus, sorry. And a universal reference point is assumed. White people are just people. Within this construction, whites can represent humanity, while people of color are never just people, but always, most particularly black people, Asian people, etc., can only represent their own racialized experiences. That's literally just what you're fucking doing. Good Lord. The projection, the self... God. The discourse of universalism functions similarly to the discourse of individualism, but instead of declaring that we all need to see each other as individuals, everyone is different, the person declares that we all need to see each other as human beings. Everyone is the same. Of course we're all humans, and I do not critique universalism in general, but when applied to racism, universalism functions to deny the significance of race and the advantages of being white. That's the point of universalism. You treat each other the same, not based on things they can't. Good. I can't decide whether... Like, I know that they're intentionally lying too many times to just be like, oh, she's just fucking stupid. But I almost don't know all of the time if some of it isn't that she's just fucking stupid. Further, universalism assumes that whites and people of color have the same realities, the same experiences, in the same context. I feel comfortable in this majority white classroom, so you must too. The same responses from others, and assumes that the same doors are open to all. Acknowledging racism as a system of privilege conferred on whites challenges claims to universalism. Remember, she already differentiated racism as in race-based discrimination and racism as in all of that shit. She's choosing to redefine things so that she can continue about trying to see it in a certain particular way. She just chose to redefine universalism just there. So then she could just sort of proceed so the pieces fit together how she wants. Because they didn't already fit together, they didn't go together. So, if we rearrange this and redefine this, it actually kind of goes together, so then I'm right. So buy my book. Remember, later on she writes this as a book. This is just a little paper. At the same time that whites are taught to see their interests and perspectives as universal, no. They're also taught to value the individual and to see themselves as individuals rather than as part of a racially socialized group. You were just taught to see yourself as universally objective. I don't see myself as universally objective. I'm just universally objectively saying that about you. Individualism erases history and hides the ways in which wealth has been distributed and accumulated over generations to benefit whites today. It's coming close to explicitly touching on communism. Remember, this is just communism, but race as a tool. It allows whites to view themselves as unique and original outside of socialization and unaffected by the relentless racial messages in the culture. Individualism also allows whites to distance themselves from the actions of their racial group and demand to be granted the benefit of the doubt as individuals in all cases. There. That's literally just the collective racial soul shit. It's that blood debt historical shit. Oh yeah, when they also talk about wealth and generational wealth, they're also mostly talking about whole societies. They're not talking individuals because they're collectivists. They're not individualists. They're talking whole societies, as in the whole of the American society. And not even that, the whole of the white American society as one whole single society. Remember, they like to conflate in poor Appalachian whites with wealthy whites in America. That's all one singular thing, and the wealth of that allows for opportunities and everything that the wealth of, say, a very poor, impoverished Central American community doesn't have access to because of the generations of something or other and all this horse shit, and because Western European societies have a tradition as of the past so many centuries of priding universalism and individualism and striving for that, because we found that it actually tends to work pretty well. That's what they're talking about. Every fucking time. A corollary to this unracialized identity is the ability to recognize whiteness as something that is significant and that operates in society, but to not see how it relates to one's own life. In this form, a white person recognizes whiteness as real, but as the individual problem of other bad white people. I think she's talking about upper class white liberals that are like, oh, white supremacy and whiteness is bad and everything, but not she's fucking talking about herself, 100%. And remember, at no point does she give any proof. She's just drawing propositions. And if we do this, we could possibly see it like this, because all they care about is how can we see it through this way we chose to see it. And if we can explain it that way, it's as good as gold. Because objectivity, universalism, and individualism, that's all just white culture. That's all just whiteness and white people and trying to perpetuate the habitus, guys. It's not a cult. Given the ideology of individualism, whites often respond defensively when linked to other whites as a group or accused of collectively benefiting from racism, because as individuals, each white person is different from any other white person and expects to be seen as such. Collectivism. If you push them hard enough, they outright advocate for collective punishment. I don't know how else to it's just collectivism. It's racial collectivism. This narcissism is not necessarily the result of a consciously held belief that whites are superior to others, although that may play a role, but a result of the white racial insulation ubiquitous in dominant culture. A general white inability to see non-white perspectives as significant, except in sporadic and impotent reflexes which have little or no long-term momentum or political usefulness. They're talking about revolution. The no long-term momentum or use, their momentum. These aren't useful except for the ways you want them to be useful. We want them to be useful this way. In what way? The fucking revolution. She's just baseline advocating for racism as in racial prejudice. And your aversion to that and your disagreement with that is your systemic racism showing. They are just racist. She is absolutely just racist here. But it's the racial prejudice thing. It's not necessarily that anyone different. It's racial collectivism. And it's fucking disgusting. Whites invoke these seemingly contradictory discourses. We're either all unique or we are all the same, interchangeably. No. Both discourses work to deny white privilege and the significance of race. Further, on the cultural level, being an individual or being a human outside of a racial group is a privilege only afforded to white people. Again, with the white people have no culture. Like, no, you're asserting that. But okay. In other words, people of color are almost always seen as having a race and described as, in racial terms, the black man. But whites rarely are the man. Allowing whites to see themselves as objective and non-racialized. No, that's a you problem. People tend to see themselves as they see themselves and see anyone on another outside group as the outside group. You're just staring prejudice in the face, but you don't know what to call it. In turn, being seen and seeing ourselves as individuals outside of race frees whites from the psychic burden of race in a wholly racialized society. Psychic burden. What is the psychic burden? Oh, these people want to use poetry as part of science. They want to kind of finagle it enough and be poetic and pretty enough with their words and everything, but want to use that as actual academia. Race and racism become their problems, not ours. Challenging these frameworks becomes a kind of unwelcome shock to the system because it's absolutely true. Obviously, I gotta read Hegel. He starts off his phenomenology of spirit just bitching and moaning that philosophy isn't held up as one of the great hard sciences. The disavowal of race as an organizing factor both of individual white consciousness and the institutions of society at large is necessary to support current structures of capitalism and domination. Yeah, they like to conflate dominant and dominating. Whenever you hear domination, those are both. They aren't actually the same word, dominant and dominating. But, okay. For without it, the correlation between the disruption of social resources and unearned white privilege would be evident. What she doesn't realize she's bitching about is the fact that treating people individually and not as their collective race actually tends to make societies work better and function better, and economies tend to grow and prosper, and people tend to be happier and not treat each other like garbage. Oh, that's just a white people thing! Are you fucking me? The existence of structural inequality undermines the claim that privilege is simply a reflection of hard work and virtue. Because it's not 100% one way, and there's some wiggle room, then it definitely is 100% the other way. And you denying it is just showing your white privilege. You're just being fragile. Because it's okay. You don't have to resist or anything. You just don't realize the habitus is working through you. It's not a cult, guys. Therefore, inequality must be hidden or justified as resulting from lack of effort. Individualism accomplishes both of these tasks. At the same time, the individual presented as outside these relations cannot exist without its disavowed other. Back to Hegel, these people believe that any and everything cannot exist in itself except by defined from what it is not. Freud was kind of this way as well. It's the, I am white. What is white? White is not black. That's it. I am a man. What is a man? A man is what is not a woman. That's why they can't define what is a woman. Because it has to be defined by what it is not. Thus, an essential dichotomy is formed between specifically raced others and the unraced individual. That's what I'm fucking saying. Whites have deep investments in race, for the abstract depends on the particular. They need raced others as the backdrop against which they may rise. Exposing this dichotomy destabilizes white identity. Yeah, it's like the most fucked up psychotic yin-yang version that I've ever fucking seen. It's not, oh, races are genetic groups and whiteness and everything. That's not what they're talking about. They don't give half a shit about genetic groups. She's asserting that there's a secret conspiracy that we're all in on. It's literally the race matrix. And until we awaken, and it doesn't matter if we've already awakened, because if we resist taking the course again and really confronting our fragility, because remember the videos earlier, then we're still just perpetuating it because we're just, our racial stamina is low. And we're just tired and we're being fragile because the habitus. Entitlement to racial comfort. In the dominant position, whites are almost always racially comfortable and thus have developed unchallenged expectations to remain so, because we tend to have a culture to not base and judge people on their race. That whites have not had to build tolerance for racial discomfort, and thus, when racial discomfort arises, whites typically respond as if something is wrong and blame the person or event that triggered the discomfort, usually a person of color. So, major projection. This blame results in a socially sanctioned array of countermoves against the perceived source of the discomfort, including penalization, retaliation, isolation, ostracization, and refusal to continue engagement. Meaning, people don't tend to want to talk to you or engage with you or be friendly with you if you're actively trying to hyper-focus on race at every single point and trying to make them feel bad about things they disagree with. But okay, white insistence on racial comfort ensures that racism will not be faced. Remember, racism, not racism. This insistence also functions to punish those who break white codes of comfort. You know, if you discriminate on people and treat them based on the actions of others, we don't tend to want to associate with you. Whites often confuse comfort with safety and state that we don't feel safe when what we really mean is that we don't feel comfortable. Oh yeah, she's always making a really, really rough neighborhood city. Oh, it's definitely because it's a black city or a black place. It couldn't possibly be that. It couldn't possibly be that Detroit or anything like that. This trivializes our history of brutality towards people of color and perverts the reality of that history. Because we don't think complexly about racism. We don't ask ourselves what safety means from a position of societal dominance or the impact on people of color given our history for whites to complain about our safety when we're merely talking about racism. We're merely talking about it. We're just talking about it. No, you're not. Anytime you hear merely or just, you already know. I'm just. Anyone who's ever had to deal with children knows perfectly well. It's not just. Quit with the just. It's not just. I'm just. No, that's not what you're just doing. You're actively trying to misrepresent it so that you can go away with whatever you want. These people are actively trying to insist that we need a traditionally racist society. These people are just racist and can't possibly understand why we should want a society that isn't racist. The structures, the larger society, the collectivist, because they're all collectivists. That's the only fucking way it makes sense. God fucking Lord. Racial arrogance. Ideological racism includes strongly positive images of the white self as well as strongly negative images of racial others. This self-image engenders a self-perpetuating sense of entitlement because many whites believe their financial and professional successes are the result of their own efforts while ignoring the fact of white privilege. Because most whites have not been trained to think complexly about racism in schools or mainstream discourse, and because it benefits white dominance not to do so, we have a very limited understanding of racism. Again, it's the complex racism rather than the simple discrimination racism. So that's why it's not okay to be white, or it's not okay to be proud to be white or anything. because that's part of white supremacy and racism, and the complex racism, the whole structure of privilege and benefit, a possible potential benefit, and you can't see it because it tends to benefit you not to think about it because you're already getting any benefit. And if you're getting any kind of negativity, then you would be thinking about it, but you're not. So yeah, but again, it's not individually, it's collectively, because you're a whole collective, because they're fucking collectivists. And so you really only think that you did anything for yourself. Really, you didn't. It's only because you're white. Yet dominance leads to racial arrogance. Remember, dominance, not dominate, as in being predominant, or predominantly, or mostly. Yet dominance leads to racial arrogance. The not actual arrogance about your race, it's the complex whatever, because you're not thinking complexly. You're not overthinking everything like a fucking midwit meme. Yet dominance leads to racial arrogance, and in this racial arrogance, whites have no computation about debating the knowledge of people who have thought complexly about race. See, you don't understand because we have thought complexly. You haven't because you haven't come to our conclusions. We have because you know we have come to our conclusions. Whites generally feel free to dismiss these informed perspectives rather than have the humility to acknowledge that they are unfamiliar, reflect on them further, or seek more information. It's so arrogant that you don't just shut up and accept what we're saying. It just shows your privilege, your racial arrogance. How dare you doubt what we're saying? Because we've thought more complexly about it than you have, and you know this because we've told you this. And we know that you haven't because you haven't already come to our conclusion while still benefiting from being white. And we know that you benefit from being white because you are white, because you're a part of the collective. You just don't know it because of the habitus. This intelligence and expertise are often trivialized and countered with simplistic platitudes, i.e., people just need to ... It doesn't matter if you're right, they're simplistic platitudes. This really reminds me of something being too reductionist. What they really mean is that you're summing it up accurately, but in a way that won't convince other people, in a way that makes it look bad. You're being reductionist, you're being counter-revolutionary, you're being overly simplistic. Obviously, it doesn't sound good because you're being too simplistic. And you don't understand that you're being arrogant because of your race. Because of white social, economic, and political power within a white dominant culture, whites are positioned to legitimize people of color's assertions of racism. Yet whites are the least likely to see, understand, or be invested in validating those assertions and being honest about their consequences. So that's what they mean by they are positioned. Just circumstantially, you might, if you as the collective were to all just sort of shut up and agree with it, you have a lot of ability to do and say things. Why aren't you using your platform for the thing I want you to use it for? Which leads whites to claim that they disagree with perspectives that challenge their worldview, when in fact they don't understand the perspective. See, it's just because you haven't used your platform for what I want. Now other people haven't heard it, and so they just don't know. So they think they disagree. It doesn't matter what they think they've heard or think they know. It's just that obviously. Well, haven't you heard? Don't you know that? Haven't you heard what I heard? You only disagree because you don't know. You haven't heard. You haven't been told what I know. Thus, you haven't been awakened, obviously. This should all be ringing a lot of bells and be very familiar because it's all the same shit. It's all the same fallacy horse shit. This is just a gigantic scheme that really refines into the worst of human potential for every fallacy. Jesus Christ. This racial arrogance, coupled with the need for racial comfort, also has whites insisting that people of color explain white racism in the right way. The right way is generally politely and rationally, without any show of emotional upset. You know, having a cordial in-depth discussion so that we can actually be respectful with each other. No, that's just white culture. That's just a perpetuation of white supremacy culture. I'll get into that more. It's fucking psychotic. When explained in a way that white people can see and understand, racism's validity may be granted. References to dynamics of racism that white people do not understand are usually rejected out of hand. However, whites are usually more receptive to validating white racism if that racism is constructed as residing in individual white people other than themselves. She doesn't understand that. Does she realize that she's implying that non-white people are semi-sentient collective hive minds that you just yell at and they'll get you? What? You're just being... You're just showing your white arrogance and white supremacy and everything, and your white fragility. Because you don't like it when people are pieces of shit to you. And try to use emotional arguments and fallacies rather than actually showing that you're correct. Because remember, these are just different ways of knowing. They're all valid. They're just ways of knowing. Racial belonging. White people enjoy a deeply internalized, largely unconscious state of racial belonging in U.S. society. It's not that it's not there. You're just unconscious of it. You haven't awakened yet. You haven't achieved gnosis yet. This racial belonging is instilled via the whiteness embedded in the culture at large. Everywhere we look, we see our own racial image reflected back at us, in our heroes and heroines, in standards of beauty, in our role models and teachers, in our textbooks and historical memory, in the media, in religious iconography, including the image of God himself, etc. These are literally the same arguments the Nazis were using. You have to be shown these kind of things, and that there's a... My fucking God. If any of you have watched the Toward a Critical Race Theory of Education series I did, this is the same shit. It's just more of the same shit. It's just that same storytelling cult horseshit. Reality is created by the stories. If we all just believe it, then it's all true because postmodernism, whatever. Racial belonging becomes deeply internalized and taken for granted. In dominant society, interruption of racial belonging is rare and thus destabilizing and frightening to whites. Good fucking Lord. Interruption of racial belonging, meaning making people feel like they don't belong because of their race. So, in the actual racially discriminating against people, being racist against them, rather than the systemic power, whatever shit, makes them feel destabilized and frightened. Wild. Being racist to people, the interruption of racial belonging, that's the racial discrimination, racism that we typically know. The overly simplistic form of racism. But the other one, where they say that whites cannot be you can't be racist to white people, it's impossible. They're just racist and trying to go all the way around, trying to justify it without actually say it. But then they're keeping the word and using it for something else, but then acting like they're just continuing on. Whites consistently choose and enjoy racial segregation. Remember, it's not even necessarily physical segregation or tangible or anything. It's subconsciously, you're just happening to not happen to see something. That's the same as segregation. Living, working, and playing in racial segregation is unremarkable as long as it is not named or made explicitly internalized. Wow, there's no people of color here. This is all segregated. Why are you only watching things with white people in it? That's the same as segregation, guys. That's what they're saying. That's why they say it's worse than in Jim Crow. It's so bad because it It's even worse because you're just unaware of it. It's all the same. And if you don't believe it's not there, you're just unaware of it. That's what they mean. They say it right fucking to your face. For example, in many anti-racist endeavors, a common exercise is to separate into caucus groups by race in order to discuss issues specific to your racial group and without the pressure or stress of other groups' presence. So, segregating. Generally, people of color appreciate this opportunity for racial fellowship, but white people typically become very uncomfortable, agitated, and upset, even though this temporary separation is in the service of addressing racism. Why would one group be uncomfortable while the other group is comfortable with racial segregation? With real, physical, tangible racial segregation? We're just trying to point out how racist you are so that you can know that you're a racist. Responses include a disorienting sense of themselves as not just people, but most particularly white people, a curious sense of loss about this contrived and temporary separation which they don't feel about the real and ongoing segregation in their daily lives, and anxiety about not knowing what is going on in the groups of color. Or it could be that you are segregating by race while claiming that one group is bad because that's a bad thing to do. That's just segregation with extra steps. The irony, again, is that most whites live in racial segregation every day, and in fact, are the group most likely to intentionally choose that segregation, albeit obscured in racially coded language, such as seeking good schools and good neighborhoods. It's just coded, and it doesn't have to be conscious or not. If you can see it a certain way, it is that way. And if it's not conscious, it's unconscious because of the habitus, because of the demiurge, because you're just a potential agent Smith and you don't know it, so they need to make sure that you know it. This segregation is unremarkable until it is named as deliberate, i.e., we are now going to separate by race for a short exercise. I posit that it is the intentionality that is so disquieting. As long as we don't mean to separate, as long as it just happens that we live segregated lives, we can maintain a fragile identity of racial innocence. It couldn't possibly be that we're wrong, because we're definitely right, because we've awakened. We know. You just don't know. It's even worse, because you're just an unconscious slave to the white supremacist demiurge, obviously. White fragility. And if you don't think this is a fucking cult, psychic freedom. Because race is constructed as residing in people of color, whites don't bear the social burden of race. We move easily through our society without a sense of ourselves as racialized subjects. She's literally just admitting that she's racist and doesn't know how to deal with it. That must be everyone. That just must be everyone. Yeah, definitely not just a me thing. That's everyone. And I didn't think I was a racist, but we see race as operating when people of color are present, but all white spaces as pure spaces, untainted by race vis-a-vis the absence of the carriers of race, and thereby the racial polluters, people of color. Good fucking God! I mean, justify to yourself not wanting black people in the white pools all you want, but good fucking God, that's racist. She needs to do some fucking soul searching. Like, just come to grips with yourself. Accept it or deal with it. Like, Jesus Christ, you're just racist, Robin DiAngelo. She seems like a genuine clinical narcissist that can't see it outside of herself and how she sees it, so therefore she's projecting it onto everyone else. and she can't handle the idea that she could potentially be perceived as racist. Like, just plain old racist. So it must be an unconscious everyone problem. This perspective is perfectly captured in a familiar white statement. I was lucky. I grew up in an all-white neighborhood, so I didn't learn anything about racism. Who are you quoting? In this discursive moment, whiteness gains its meaning through its purported lack of encounter with non-whiteness. Remember, it's that defining oneself only through what you are not horseshit that they've been doing this entire time. Because racial segregation is deemed socially valuable while simultaneously unracial and unremarkable, we rarely, if ever, have to think about race and racism and receive no penalty for not thinking about it. In fact, whites are more likely to be penalized primarily by other whites for bringing race up in a social justice context than for ignoring it. However, it is acceptable to bring race up indirectly and in ways that reinforce racist attitudes, i.e., warning other whites to stay away from certain neighborhoods, etc. Good God. She's just a fucking racist suburban soccer mom. God fucking, she's just a suburban soccer mom that doesn't know that she's actually the problem. This frees whites from carrying the psychic burden of race. This frees whites from carrying the psychic burden of race. Race is for people of color to think about. It is what happens to them. They can bring it up if it is an issue for them, although if they do, we can dismiss it as a personal problem, the race card, or the reason for their problems. This allows whites to devote much more psychological energy to other issues and prevents us from developing the stamina to sustain attention in an issue as charged and uncomfortable as race. I mean, it just kind of explains itself. White fragility. Constant messages that we are more valuable through representation in everything. Living in a white dominant context, we receive constant messages that we are better and more important than people of color. Oh, big yikes! These messages operate on multiple levels and are conveyed in a range of ways. For example, our centrality in history books, historical representations and perspectives, our centrality in media and advertising. For example, a recent Vogue magazine cover boldly stated, "The world's next top models," and every woman on the front cover was white. Egad! Our teachers, role models, heroes and heroines, everyday discourse on good neighborhoods and schools and who is in them, popular TV shows centered around friendship circles that are all white, religious iconography that depicts God, Adam and Eve, and other key figures as white, commentary on news stories about how shocking any crime is that occurs in white suburbs, and the lack of a sense of loss about the absence of people of color in most white people's lives. While one may explicitly reject the notion that one is inherently better than the other, one cannot avoid internalizing the message of white superiority, as it is ubiquitous in mainstream culture. She's never been to a rundown Appalachian town, and it shows. What does white fragility look like? A large body of research about children and race demonstrates that children start to construct ideas about race very early. A sense of white superiority and knowledge of racial power codes appears to develop as early as preschool. Marty states, as in other Western nations, white children born in the United States inherit the moral predicament of living in a white supremacist society. Raised to experience their racially based advantages as fair and normal, white children receive little, if any, instruction regarding the predicament they face, let alone any guidance in how to resolve it. Therefore, they experience or learn about racial tension without understanding Euro-Americans' historical responsibility for it, and knowing virtually nothing about their contemporary roles in perpetuating it. At the same time that it is ubiquitous, white superiority also remains unnamed and explicitly denied by most whites. It's just everywhere. I mean, just look at the inequity across all of the collectives. Obviously, it's there, you just can't see it because you benefit as a collective, as a psychic collective. And you're unaware of it because it's hiding it from you, and you're just... If white children become adults who explicitly oppose racism, as do many, they often organize their identity around a denial of the racially based privileges they hold that reinforce racist disadvantage for others. Even if you oppose racism, it's even worse because you're unaware of it, because you're not actively, constantly repenting and submitting and everything. It's even worse because you think you're against it, but really, What is particularly problematic about this contradiction is that white moral objection to racism increases white resistance to acknowledging complicity with it. It's like it doesn't matter if you've already taken the course, you're just trying to get out of taking the course again, subconsciously. In a white supremacist context, white identity in large part rests upon a foundation of a superficial racial toleration and acceptance. Whites who position themselves as liberal often opt to protect what they perceive as their moral reputations rather than recognize or change their participation in systems of inequity and domination. Dominance, not domination, but okay. It doesn't matter how much you object to racism, you're still part of it. You go to work, you buy groceries in this white supremacist society. It's ubiquitous, and just because it's impossible to see and explain without just yelling and using fallacies and emotional appeals doesn't mean it's not there. And the fact that you disagree means that it's even worse than we thought. Obviously. In so responding, whites invoke the power to choose when, how, and how much to address or challenge racism. The complex racism, not the simple crude racism. Thus, pointing out white advantage will often trigger patterns of confusion, defensiveness, and righteous indignation. But how would that differentiate from just lying to them and attacking them? Like, regardless of if you're right, how would that, as a sign, differentiate from if someone was just lying to them? Not you, not saying you, even if you were completely right, someone else completely lying to them, how would that be different? It wouldn't. You're full of shit. When confronted about a challenge to white racial codes, many white liberals use the speech of self-defense. This discourse enables defenders to protect their moral character against what they perceive as accusations and attack, while deflecting any recognition of culpability or need of accountability. Because you're not just rolling over and submitting. It's the same thing, guys. Fucking stupid. Focusing on restoring their moral standing through these tactics, whites are able to avoid the question of white privilege. See, they're just tactics, and it doesn't matter what you think. It's subconscious because we're right. It's not a cult. You're not supposed to question it. You're supposed to just roll over. And even if you just roll over, you're just doing it for your own reputation. So it's more, and it's even worse. Obviously, you're supposed to struggle and suffer. That's the point. You can't even enjoy suffering. You're supposed to suffer and it be bad because you're... Obviously. Those who lead whites in discussions of race may find the discourse of self-defense familiar. Via this discourse, whites position themselves as victimized, slammed, blamed, attacked, and being used as punching bags, referencing her own paper in 2006. Whites who describe interactions in this way are responding to the articulation of counter-narratives. Nothing physically out of the ordinary has ever occurred in any interracial discussion that I am aware of. It's not true or false, it's narratives and counter-narratives. That little, nothing has happened that I'm aware of. Good fucking lord. These self-defense claims work on multiple levels to position the speakers as morally superior while obscuring the true power of their social locations. Blame others with less social power for their discomfort, falsely position that discomfort as dangerous, and reinscribe racist imagery. Because it couldn't possibly be that you're wrong, Robin. You couldn't possibly be being used because you're racist and you feel guilty, so you're just desperately grasping at straws. Well, what do I do? What do I do? How do I atone? How do I repent? This is the way. It's not a cult, but this is the way. You do all of this and drag everyone down with you. Claiming that they have been treated unfairly via a challenge to their position or an expectation that they listen to the perspectives and experiences of people of color, they are able to demand that more social resources, such as time and attention, be channeled in their direction to help them cope with this mistreatment. Because everything's just tactics. Nothing's actually true. I mean, read Michel Foucault. It's all just narratives and counter-narratives. These people are fucking narcissists. 100%. They're using all of the same arguments, all of the same fucking strategies. These people are just fucking narcissists. Or used by narcissists. A cogent example of white fragility occurred recently during a workplace anti-racism training I co-facilitated with an anti-racial team. One of the white participants left the session and went back to her desk, upset at receiving what appeared to the training team as sensitive and diplomatic feedback on how some of her statements had impacted several people of color in the room. Well, it's just, you're just being fragile. Why are you so upset? It's just sensitive and diplomatic. At break, several other white participants approached us, the trainers, and reported that they had talked to the woman at her desk, and she was very upset that her statements had been challenged. Gonna ignore what she said, but it's just that it was a disagreement. It's just that it's disagreement and challenge and counter-narratives. Because they aren't actually concerned with anything. They're just fucking power grabbing. That's all it amounts to. They wanted to alert us to the fact that she literally might be having a heart attack. Upon questioning from us, they clarified that they meant this literally. These coworkers were sincere in their fear that the young woman might actually physically die as a result of the feedback. Of course, when news of the woman's potential fatal condition reached the rest of the participant group, all attention was immediately focused back onto her and away from the impact she had had on the people of color. You're just, As Vode states, if privilege is defined as a legitimization of one's entitlement to resources, it can also be defined as permission to escape or avoid any challenges to this entitlement. How the fuck can anyone read? That's it. How can anyone read this and think that she's not just full of shit? They're not. They aren't reading it. I'm 12 pages into 17. They're just not reading this. They're just going along with it, skimming through. Yep, that's fine. Looks good to me. I don't care. They're just not actually reading it. And then the ones that actually do are either like, this is insane, or they are insane cultists. Yeah, she's not actually literally maybe having a heart attack. It's just an unconscious expression of her white fragility because of the habitus. It's causing her so much distress to be challenged on her white superiority complex. The Demi are just willing to sacrifice her. Oh my God. How could you? Because they're taking. These people are fucking psychotic. These people are narcissists. Because a narcissist will absolutely let you die and expect you to let yourself die for them. The language of violence that many whites use to describe anti-racist endeavors is not without significance, as it is another example of the way that white fragility distorts and perverts reality. Do I really have to explain that one to you? By employing terms that connote physical abuse, whites tap into the classic discourse of people of color, particularly African Americans, as dangerous and violent. So just, ignore what they're trying to say and just, you're just being fragile. You're distorting. Because reality is whatever we say it is. It's not a cult. This discourse perverts the actual direction of danger that exists between whites and others, collectively, not individually. You might actually be in danger individually, But we don't care about that. We care about the collective and historically, whatever fits our historical narrative for our purposes. The history, right out the gate, the history of brutal, extensive, institutionalized, and ongoing violence perpetuated by whites against people of color, slavery, genocide, lynching, whipping, forced sterilization, and medical experimentation, to mention a few, becomes profoundly trivialized when whites claim they don't feel safe or are under attack when in the real situation of merely talking about race with people of color. Merely, just. We don't care because historically, and it only makes sense if you're thinking collectively. Individually, they even concede. You might be right individually, but we don't care. Because they only care collectively. Is the habitus and the folk soul and the collective, the social whatever. The use of this discourse illustrates how fragile and ill-equipped most white people are to confront racial tensions and their subsequent projection of this tension onto people of color. Goldberg argues that the questions surrounding racial discourse should not focus so much on how true stereotypes are, but how the truth claims they offer are a part of a larger worldview that authorizes the normalized. They're literally implying that they believe that stereotypes are true, but you shouldn't focus on that, because you should focus on the swing of the worldview, not the individual stereotyping, not the stereotypes, even though the stereotypes are true. Yeah, so they're racist against racism trademark. But how the truth claims they offer are a part of a larger worldview that authorizes and normalizes forms of domination and control. Further, it is relevant to ask, under what conditions are those truth claims clung to most tenaciously? Bonilla Silva documents a manifestation of white fragility in his study of colorblind white racism. He states, because the new racial climate in America forbids the open expression of racially based feelings, views, and positions, expressing racism, when whites discuss issues that make them uncomfortable, they become almost incomprehensible. I don't mean, but probing forbidden racial issues results in verbal incoherence, digressions, long pauses, repetition, and self-corrections. Someone getting nervous because you're claiming they're racist when racism is bad. Or because you're actively refusing to engage with what they are saying because you don't care if it's true or not, even though you admit it might well be true, but you don't care because you admit you don't care, because that's not your goal. Your goal is for them to suffer and then eventually become enlightened with you. This is fucking Jesus Christ. I'm not religious, but this is some fucking demonic shit. He suggests that this incoherent talk is a function of talking about race in a world that insists race does not matter. These are psychopaths and narcissists that refuse to engage genuinely and honestly, and it's made into a gigantic philosophy and strategy. It's the exact same thing. This incoherence is one demonstration that many white people are unprepared to engage, even on a preliminary level, in an exploration of their racial perspectives that could lead to a shift in their understanding of racism. Because they're nervous and stammering, it just shows. It couldn't possibly be that we're wrong. It couldn't possibly be that we're just projecting our worldview onto them and trying to emotionally guide them, and this is fucking abuse. This is abusing people. This is actively working them up into emotional states and then guiding them and forcing them to be convinced that they are bad so that you can win them over and convince them of anything. That's how cults work. That's just literally how cults work. That's what they do. Because their only goal is your commitment to the cult and to the cult leaders. This lack of preparedness results in the maintenance of white power, because the ability to determine which narratives are authorized and which are suppressed is the foundation of cultural domination. Sure, keep telling yourself that. Actually, don't. I'm not even gonna keep that bit. That's fucking insane. Oh, should we talk about this? Oh. Or like, hey, no, that's kind of fucked up. What are you even saying? Further, this lack of preparedness has further implications, for if whites cannot engage with an exploration of alternate racial perspectives, they can only reinscribe white perspectives as universal. Because you're unwilling to accept our universally objective perspective that all of the... I'm just at a loss for the lack of self-awareness. Oh, because you don't want to engage in this explicit racism that we say you definitely have, that then you're just trying to show how universal your perspective is. Well, forgetting that that's what you're doing, Robin. You're acting as though you have the universal perspective. I don't know. However, an assertion that whites do not engage with dynamics of racial discourse is somewhat misleading. White people do notice the racial locations of racial others and discuss this freely among themselves, albeit often in coded ways. She's admitting that she secretly talks about things. She's admitting that she secretly is openly racist and talks about it. Their refusal to directly acknowledge this race talk results in a kind of split consciousness that leads to the incoherence Bonilla Silva documents above. Oh, because you're upset and you're getting nervous and stammering. That just shows that you definitely are, because Robin DiAngelo, do that, so you must be doing that. She's just a fucking narcissist that can't handle the fact that she's racist, because she would realize that would look horrific on her. So it's impossible. It must be absolutely everyone that sees it that way. This denial also guarantees that the racial misinformation that circulates in the culture and frames their perspectives will be left unexamined. So why do you do it, Robin? The continual retreat from the discomfort of authentic racial engagement in a culture infused with racial disparity limits the ability to form authentic connections across racial lines and results in a perpetual cycle that works to hold racism in place. She's saying that she can't bring herself to genuinely connect with people who aren't white. She's just racist. And therefore everyone must be. It's because every white people. And if you're pretending, if you say that you're not, obviously you are. You just don't understand she's just racist and can't accept it. And finally, the conclusion. White people often believe that multicultural and anti-racist education is only necessary for those who interact with minorities or in diverse environments. However, the dynamics discussed here suggest that it is critical that all white people build the stamina to sustain conscious and implicit engagement with race. When whites posit race as non-operative because there are few, if any, people of color in their immediate environments, whiteness is reinscribed ever more deeply. Because it's subconscious. If you're not constantly looking at and thinking about every single possible demographic and hyperfixating on everything to do with race ever, then that's the idea that you could possibly not be constantly thinking about race is that's the racism trademark. That's the complex systemic racism. Obviously, because you're not focused on it, then that This is, you can just fucking read her paper in an hour. This is what they think. Then everyone jumps on and defends it. Like, oh, no, it's just talking about that. No. People that defend this shit, with how they defend it, are actually telling on themselves and showing they haven't actually read it. And showing, therefore, that they are full of shit. And everything they are saying is baseless. It is based on nothing. It is based on what they were told to say and what they figure, because they are just full of shit. When whites only notice race to others, we reinscribe whiteness by continuing to posit whiteness as universal and non-whiteness as other. But again, you're defining whiteness as not thinking about race. Further, if we can't listen to or comprehend the perspectives of people of color, we cannot bridge cross-racial divides. Because I say that if you aren't willing to do this, then you can't possibly comprehend their perspectives. And if you can't do that, then we can't cross. She just does this insane, over-elaborate setup. And then by the end, it's like, oh, since we can't do this, then we can't do this. Well, why can't we do this? Because I said all this. Horse shit. It just builds a foundation of absolute garbage and tricks you into trying to accept it. And then, and since all of these, let's genuinely build all these connections, but it's built on garbage. A continual retreat from the discomfort of authentic racial engagement results in a perpetual cycle that works to hold racism in place. Not racism discrimination. They believe that everyone is that way, and that's just sort of a factor of the universe and humanity. So let's translate that. Retreat from discomfort, meaning not caring to speak to someone who is accusing you of something, of authentic racial engagement, bending over and accepting everything you're told no matter what by them, results in the continuation of racism trademark. The fact that you won't bend over and accept what you're being told is preventing us from having our utopia. Submit, because you're preventing us from having utopia. While anti-racist efforts ultimately seek to transform institutionalized racism, anti-racist education may be most effective by starting at the micro level. The goal is to generate the development of perspectives and skills that enable all people, regardless of racial location, to be active initiators of change. The development of perspectives is just convincing you of what they want. Active initiators of change is activists. Good little activists for their cause. Convince you of anything they want so you can be a good little activist for them. Using education on the micro level, that means individually. How do we do this collectively? I don't know. We must try it on the micro level through education. The micro level just means it individually because they're only thinking collectively. So micro to the collective is individual. Shit's got me fucked up. Since all individuals who live within a racist system are enmeshed in its relations, this means that all are responsible for either perpetuating or transforming that system. That's collectivism. That's collective punishment. That's collective guilt. That's fucking insane. However, although all individuals play a role in keeping the system active, the responsibility for change is not equally shared. White racism is ultimately a white problem, and the burden for interrupting it belongs to white people. Do you get it? Do you get it? It's effectively ethno-nationalism that demonizes white people. And if you aren't fixing it, you are responsible, no matter what you have done or not done. It's literally just anti-white ethno-nationalism. Conversations about whiteness might best happen within the context of a larger conversation about racism. It is useful to start at the micro level of analysis, individually, and move to the macro, collectively. From the individual out to the interpersonal, societal, and institutional. I'm right. Starting with the individual and moving outward to the ultimate framework of racism, whiteness, capital W whiteness, allows for the pacing that is necessary for many white people for approaching the challenging study of race. In this way, a discourse on whiteness becomes part of a process rather than an event. She's going to get into this is a lifelong commitment. This can't be just a thing you do. You need to change every aspect of your life and yourself and be fully committed to this because you are responsible because of collectivism. This is just collective ethno-nationalism, but specifically anti-white collective ethno-nationalism. Because this was ultimately born out of the old black nationalism thing that spawned the Black Panthers, and that kind of fizzled out into all of the things that it did. That's what this is. Many white people have never been given direct or explicit information about racism before, and often cannot explicitly see, feel, or understand it. See, that's why you can't understand it. People of color are generally much more aware of racism on a personal level, but due to the wider society's silence and denial of it, often do not have a macro-level framework from which to analyze their experiences. Further, dominant society aligns different roles to different groups of color, and a critical consciousness about racism varies not only between individuals within a group, but also between groups. I don't know how many times I have to just say collectivism. This is just collectivism, but race. For example, many African Americans relate having been prepared by parents to live in a racist society, while many Asian heritage people say that racism was never directly discussed in their homes. A macro-level analysis may offer a framework to understand different interpretations and performances across and between racial groups. In this way, all parties benefit and efforts are not solely focused on whites, which works to recenter whiteness. They're literally trying to say, because there are exceptions to this rule, then that just reinforces our rule because it just takes, she's literally trying to say that, because this major exception to our rule exists, that just means our rule is even stronger because it's just trying to throw off attention. It's trying to hide itself by showing that it's not there. And she's talking about actually responsible African American parents that have to sit their kids down and let them know about a hard truth of the world. There are shitty people who will probably treat you differently. So instead of trying to get away from that and not actually focus on that and treat people like individuals, we need to accept that we all do that. We all are that, and everyone is that. Oh, you're just hiding it. Oh. All right. Almost done. Talking directly about white power and privilege, in addition to providing much needed information and shared definitions, is also in itself a powerful interruption of common and oppressive discursive patterns about race. At the same time, white people often need to reflect upon racial information and be allowed to make connections between the information and their own lives. Educators can encourage and support white participants in making their engagement a point of analysis. White fragility doesn't always manifest in overt ways. Silence and withdrawal are also functions of fragility. Who speaks, who doesn't speak, when, for how long, and with what emotional valence are all keys to understanding the relational patterns that hold oppression in place. Viewing white anger, defensiveness, silence, and withdrawal in response to issues of race through the framework of white fragility may help frame the problem as an issue of stamina building and thereby guide our interventions accordingly. And just to finish it all up, viewing it all this way, it might help. I'm not saying it definitely is. It might. What a fucking shitty way to end that. Fucking commit, you racist piece of shit. They said earlier, they don't care about proving it. They're already just running with it. They just have to get you to accept it. And they don't care about anything. They don't care about proving it because they know it's horseshit. It's just about how you see it. It's just trying to find a way to see it, because that's all their shit is based on, is finding a way to see it. For their purpose, through their lens, white fragility. But then again, I might well just be showing my white fragility. God, what a miserable fucking paper.